So, Dorothy. Okay. Are people in the room on Zoom?
Yes, they are.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Good to see all of you back here. I think I know most of the faces here. There's a few unfamiliar faces, but hopefully we'll all get familiar. I'm Bhaskar Chakravorti. And this is Fletcher East, the newspaper, which for those of you who are new to Fletcher, this is an event that we try and organize at least once a semester with the idea that Fletcher is the quintessential place for interdisciplinary conversation. And each one of you goes into a classroom with Professor Drezner or Professor Trachtman or Professor Wolff. And what you tend to study there is a topic that is, and I don't want to kind of characterize what you do in your classrooms, but I'm assuming what happens in the classroom is you have a conversation relating to the deep area of expertise of that professor, whether it's global political economy or international law or cybersecurity, or pick your professor of choice at Fletcher. So it's kind of part of the paradox and the magic of Fletcher that you can go from a cybersecurity class to a class on global political economy to a class on international law, and you are studying an intradisciplinary subject in each one of those classes. But the collective of those independent insights is actually with all of you. So quite often we kind of think of the interdisciplinary part of Fletcher as actually this part of the room. And this part of the room is really the intradisciplinary experts who have an interest in a lot of the other disciplines, but they are deep experts in their individual disciplines. So how do we now utilize this collective intelligence in ways that one could never really find anything? So we started this whole project several years back. And it's actually interesting that the first time we did this, Joel, was many years back to talk about the Rana Plaza disaster. And you were on our panel that time as well. And essentially the idea is that we take a big news topic that is on the front page of the newspaper and recognize that it's there for a reason. It's there because it's complicated. It's there because there are many elements that draw upon different forces, different disciplines. And in order to understand why it's there and what can we do about it, you actually need to take it apart using different disciplinary lenses and then put it back together. So what we do here is we organize this by having our intradisciplinary experts help look at a significant issue that's hanging on in the front pages of the newspaper through their lenses. And then after having reflected on some of that unpacking, we turn to you to look for some solutions and maybe some pathways, not necessarily an answer, but some pathways, maybe some reflections, or perhaps even a recommendation for what might be up ahead. So with that as the broad introduction to the topic, perhaps I could ask my colleague, Professor Trachtman, to just say a few words about how we got started on this project, because this session is not an outcome of, but is part of a series of outcomes that we are creating out of a much larger project. Perhaps you can say a little bit about that just to set the context.
Of course. Well, this is part of a project, as Bhaskar has said, that is being run by the Center for Business in the Global Context here and the Center for International Law and Governance, with support from the Omidyar Network. And the idea has been to try to anticipate.
I'm sorry, and the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course. Okay. The idea was to anticipate what kinds of problems would arise as the United States reviewed Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was legislated in 1996, 7 years before Facebook and 10 years before Twitter, to really grow the internet in a context in which they wouldn't have to worry about being responsible for what is said for this user-generated content. And I think I humbly would say this is a project that Fletcher and our research capabilities were made for, because what we're doing is recognizing that this problem involves a number of different countries with different legal systems, both in substantive legal areas and in the area of platform responsibility itself. And so what we did was none of us, I think, are experts in any one country's law in this area. So we engaged experts in 5 jurisdictions' laws in this area. The United States, the European Union, Brazil, India, and China. And we asked them to say, well, what do you do in these areas? And then the second thing we did was we said, well, once we get those reports, we'll engage political scientists, economists, and business specialists, lawyers, and technology policy specialists to provide an interdisciplinary analysis of this. And while we're doing that, we're thinking about international discontinuities and international cooperation to redress or to manage those international discontinuities. We'll see if there are examples from other areas, and we kind of selected, without knowing for sure how analogous they would be, international financial regulation, international tax law, and international infectious disease management. So we said there are some aspects of these platform issues and of the kinds of contagion that these platforms can provide that may have some similarities to these other areas. And let's see what happens in those areas and what we can learn. So it's kind of, I think, a nice framework of national comparison, multidisciplinary analysis, generative of ideas from other areas of international cooperation, because this is a relatively novel area. And we're hoping, and we can outline a little bit of what we think might happen in this area, what we think perhaps should happen in this area.
Great. So this is kind of, as I mentioned, part A of a 2-parter. Part B is going to happen on December 2nd. So mark your calendars, clear your calendars of anything else that you've got planned for Friday in December. And there we will, in addition to folks here, we will have several of our other contributors to this project weigh in, and we'll have people from from the platforms and from several other constituencies to kind of help us problem solve our not necessarily our way out of this box, but at least try and approach some solutions. And we try a little bit of that in the room here. So the 4 of us, Professor Drezner, Professor Wolff, Professor Trachtman, and I, we wrote some initial drafts of articles coming at these questions from our individual perspectives. What we thought we'd do a run of some of those ideas with you. So perhaps we turn to Professor Drezner to kick us off.
Sure. So thank you very much, Bhaskar and Joel, for giving me the opportunity to write about this. And in some ways, for me, this is revisiting a topic that I wrote about back in 2007. So I wrote a book that came out then called All Politics is Global, Explaining International Regulatory Change. And in that book, I made a couple of arguments. And one of the chapters was, in fact, about internet governance. So regulation, particularly international regulatory coordination, is often thought of as a standards game, coordination game, basically, in which all sides will be better off if we can agree on a certain set of standards. There might be distributional implications if you choose standard set A as opposed to standard set B, but surely everyone can agree that they would, prefer being on a particular equilibrium. In actuality, what I argued in that book is that, first of all, it might be a coordination game, but market size matters a lot in terms of determining the power of an actor to set standards. Large markets have a gravitational effect on producers. They want to be able to cater to that market. And there are also, with respect to standards, and network externality. So if you're a large market and you set a standard, it becomes easier and more becomes incentivized for other actors close to you to wind up adopting a similar standard, even if that wasn't initially your set of preferences. In this sort of world, regulatory coordination globally is possible under one of two conditions. Either first, there is truly a hegemonic actor. In other words, there's such a large superpower that if they set the standard, everyone else is just going to, bandwagon to that standard, and there's really no way other than that. That very rarely happens in world politics. The other possibility is if there is a great power concept. In other words, if you have a sufficient number of great powers that roughly agree on or negotiate what the regulatory standard should be, then you will get pretty much effective coordination. If it turns out that other countries are also on board, you get a system called harmonized governance, which is usually a combination of universal membership, international governmental organizations, as well as private orders dealing with things. If there is some dissensus, if it's just the great powers that want to do things this way, you often wind up with what's called a club governance model, where bodies like the G7 or the G20 set standards, and then everyone else really is cajoled or coerced into doing so. Absent great power consensus, you will either have a rival standards outcome or a sham standards. In a rival standards outcome, different great powers will try to set up their standards and will try to attract as many followers as possible. But obviously there will be a split because no great power is going to be successful at this. And in a sham standards outcome, this is one in which no one can agree about anything. And so very often they will agree to some sort of honorary, meaningless set of standards through an international body that has no enforcement power whatsoever. And they can always point to that as an example of them doing something if anyone asks them what's going on. But in point of fact, there is nothing going on. So the key thing to realize about this is that sometimes when you're dealing with regulatory coordination, the equilibrium outcome, the outcome in which everyone is better off actually, is one of no coordination. No, an instance in which there is no point in making an adjustment. And this is true in instances in which social mores or cultural norms are so powerful that even if there might be economic benefits in terms of agreeing to certain common standards, the fact is that the political cost, the adjustment cost are simply too great. And this is where agreeing to disagree makes a great deal of sense. Applying this to content moderation, which is what I was doing at the time, I was extremely skeptical that there would be any agreement, and this was in the mid-2000s. At that point, the great powers, which you could argue were the United States and the European Union, did not really agree on what the appropriate content moderation rule should be and regulation should be. As we know, the United States has the 1996 Communications Decency Act. Section 230 sets out certain principles. There are certain things that the US government prefers to censor and or regulate. Those are very different from things that the European Union was concerned about regulating, particular data privacy. They, in the United States, there was a strong norm of being afraid of government intrusion in terms of data privacy and trusting corporations, whereas in the European Union, it was the reverse. It was concern about corporate control over data privacy and a reliance on EU and national officials. So I was skeptical at the time there would be any sort of cooperation on content moderation, not to mention plenty of other countries that had no interest necessarily. So flash forward 15 years, and where are we now? I'm much more pessimistic that there will be any content. If you thought I was pessimistic before, I am super pessimistic now. So what has happened over the last 15 years? Well, first of all, you now have China as another legitimate great power, in terms of measured by market size or what have you. They have very different preferences when it comes to content moderation, as I learned from reading the memo, in terms of including things about harmful content. And their definition of harmful content is, let's say, very broad and much different from what you might consider the US definition of harmful content or the European definition of harmful content. The second trend is what is often called the democratic recession. But basically, you can talk about 2006, 2007 as sort of the high watermark in terms of countries that are categorized as liberal democracies. Since then, there has been a slow and steady slide downward in which some democracies have reverted to, an autocracy, and some autocracies have become much more illiberal than they used to be. This essentially means that far more countries will view online activity in the same way that China does. And so as a result, be very skeptical about any Western-led platform governance. The third difference is the blowback from Edward Snowden and revelations regarding NSA surveillance. To be clear, I don't think it's that US allies were shocked about the fact that there was this sort of surveillance going on. The problem is that they had to acknowledge that they were shocked. In other words, it was sort of an end of what we would call hypocritical governance, where a lot of US allies were willing to look the other way and not have to deal with it in public. And then suddenly it was very public. And so as a result, leaders like Angela Merkel or Lula in Brazil had no choice but to deal with this. And there were strong pushes for more data sovereignty as a result, for data to be localized rather than held by some of these firms. And then finally, a sort of shift from what we would call Web 1.0 to Web 2.0, in which essentially the network externalities effect became that much more powerful. And so as a result, you really had the rise of natural monopolies like Google or Apple or Facebook or what have you. And the rise of big tech became a problem because their primary revenue source is you. You are the product in most of these things, which means they very much want you to say whatever you can, and they also very much want access to your data. So what does this mean for the future? I'm extremely pessimistic. So there is no global consensus whatsoever on content moderation. Indeed, data localization makes national regulation, I think, far more likely than any kind of global standard, unless it's a sham standard. To some extent, firms, if they are dealing with smaller countries, can threaten either to use political voice, i.e. lobbying power, and or simply exit the market if a regulatory push goes in a way that they don't like. Also, I think this is an instance in which big tech in a variety of countries has an informational advantage over regulators. As products get more and more complicated, the fact is legislators don't know anything about this, and all you have to see is any congressional hearing on Facebook or Google or any of these things to watch the just ocean of ignorance on display by members of Congress. But even so, if you talk about regulators, you're dealing with such complex products that it is not clear that even the regulators necessarily understand what it is they're trying to regulate. And as a result, part of this is because since big tech has an informational advantage, they can often slant or provide certain kinds of information as a way to get what they want. And then finally, I'm going to add that populism is going to be an additional source of difficulty here in terms of regulating within the democracies, for the simple reason that one party's form of platform moderation is another party's censorship over vital political tools. And so the idea that you are going to actually have consensus across the political divide about the proper way to moderate platforms, I am extremely and profoundly skeptical. I will close there.
All right, I want to start by apologizing because I put this event on my calendar for 6 o'clock, like I'm a huge fool. So I'm really sorry to have shown up 20 minutes late when I thought I was coming 10 minutes early. And I'm especially sorry because my whole plan was whatever Dan said, I was just going to really disagree with that. And then I
Stop you.
what I yes. So I want to respond to your comments. I want to talk a little bit about digital misinformation in particular and sort of the moderation efforts around that. I think just to sort of go off the question of are we reaching any kind of global consensus, I think you're right. Sort of the various big players in this space and governments are not getting closer to sort of agreeing on stuff. I think the perhaps optimistic, perhaps pessimistic, but certainly true thing that's happening is the platforms themselves are getting much more aggressive about sort of setting their own moderation guidelines. So if you look at, and if you've taken one of my classes, you probably have had to, like the Facebook community guidelines, which is the first go-to for Facebook before they look at anybody's laws. Something gets reported on their platform, they say, okay, does this adhere to our community guidelines at all? If so, we take it down, or if it doesn't, then we take it down without having to worry about German hate speech law or any of this other stuff. And I think what we see when we look at sort of the past 5 or 6 years now of transparency reports from them is most of what they take down, they're taking down due to community guidelines, right? And that's partly, I think, about Facebook absorbing a lot of pieces of various countries' laws and deciding, you know, okay, hate speech law in many countries is much less liberal than it is in the United States. But we're going to incorporate a lot of that into the rules we set for ourselves, right? Just because certain kinds of things and many kinds of speech are legal here, we're going to take a much more expansive view of sort of what kinds of slurs we don't allow on our platform or things like that. And so I do think you see some consensus across countries just in the ways that the largest platforms are approaching this. And in many ways, not in all ways, the platforms are absorbing more and more of the different laws that they see being enforced, certainly being enforced by the largest countries that they know they need to satisfy. I think you can argue about whether that's a good or a bad thing. But I do think that some of the large platforms serve that role. And certainly what we see, and this also surprises me a little, is some convergence across the big platforms, right? Some convergence across kind of what Facebook is taking down, what Twitter is taking down, even though it's a slightly different product, what Google is starting to take down in this space. I think where it's hardest to see that and where it's hardest to moderate are the big video platforms. So if you look at TikTok, you look at YouTube, moderation is such a different piece there, right? And just so much harder, the work of actually kind of screening video as opposed to screening static posts is so much harder that I think there's more kind of inconsistency there, not necessarily deliberately, but just because it's really hard to figure out how to implement and how to screen content in that same way. So I agree with you that sort of the big governments in this space don't necessarily seem to be moving in the same direction. I do think that there's more consistency in this space than we saw 5 years ago, coming from this question of sort of platforms not wanting to go to the issue of, does this violate? I keep coming back to German hate speech law because they have one of the most aggressive online hate speech laws. But that helps the platforms because the alternative to I'm paying some contracted content moderator minimum wage to screen these posts against Facebook community guidelines, if they pass those guidelines, is now I need to pay a very highly trained German lawyer to tell me if this violates German law, which is actually a much harder question to resolve. So I think there are also sort of incentives pushing in that direction for the platforms themselves. I want to talk briefly about disinformation and the question of sort of what the disinformation's specific content moderation has looked like and how we've seen that evolve over really just the past 6 years, probably, right? It's an issue that gains a lot of prominence around the 2016 election in the US, and all of the big platforms are kind of for the first time really being pressured by their users and by the public to do something about fake news, disinformation in some capacity. Most of them, and this is not surprising because it's most of these platforms' first instinct in most new controversies, say we really don't want to be the arbiter of this, right? We really don't want to be the decider of, you know, what's propaganda, what's false, what's just really offensive, which political party we're going to end up upsetting, who's going to get mad at us. So it's pretty tentative throughout the 2016 campaign. And then in the aftermath of the 2016 election, there's so much anger, and there's so much anger in particular directed at Facebook, that there's a little bit more of an effort to say, okay, we're going to start doing some labeling. You see a lot of sort of the kinds of labels you all know and love now, right? Click here if you want the real information about the election results. Click here if you want to know something real about vaccines, something like that. The idea being, and it's a very sort of US idea, that the way you fight bad information is not by taking it down, but by providing people with more good information. And then I think the thing that really sort of shifts that dynamic for the big tech firms is actually COVID. And there's this wariness of kind of getting involved with political disinformation because you know you're going to upset someone, right? And in fact, you're potentially going to upset some very powerful people depending on how you do it. But around the pandemic, I would say certainly Google and Facebook really shift their policies a little bit and feel like, okay, this is not a question, though later becomes a more political question. But at first, this is not a question of sort of, are we going to upset one side of the aisle? This is a question of, are we telling people factual scientific information? I think sort of the heads of some of these companies and their grounding in engineering and sort of STEM backgrounds inform some of this, right? They're feeling like we don't want to get involved in politics, but science is something we know. In science, there's a right and a wrong answer. And you see a much more aggressive takedown regime around COVID and vaccine related misinformation. It's not perfect. There's still a lot of labeling happening, but there's, I think, much more willingness that there are real sort of life and death stakes to these decisions, and much more willingness to kind of take a side and say, this is, you know, this is truth, this is not, and we're willing to convene a panel of experts. The other thing which some of the platforms have said to me, which have sort of took me a little bit by surprise, but that made sense, is that with COVID, they could assemble panels, right? With COVID, you could say, you know, we've got the 12 most respected doctors in the world advising us about what is and is not real. And that there was no way to do that for political sort of disinformation. There was no way to say, you know, we've got a panel of people who everybody agrees are the most reputable arbiters of policy and political truth who we can kind of shift the blame to, or shift the responsibility to, and have them tell us what we should be taking down, what we shouldn't be taking down. And I don't know sort of how translatable that's going to turn out to be to other issues. I think as COVID misinformation has gotten more politicized. You've already seen a little bit more wariness and a little bit more sort of trouble around some of those decisions for the platforms. But I do think it suggests to me that sort of in the moderation decisions and the willingness to kind of come down on a very strong anti-disinformation campaign, there's a lot that has to do with sort of who are you going to upset if you take down certain disinformation, and how much can you sort of assemble a group and say this is their decision and we all respect them, look at their credentials. Let me stop there.
Fantastic. So Dan, you started with a downer and we're so grateful that Josephine arrived just in time.
Great.
to save us and make this Thursday appear so beautiful and sunny. And now we'll have Joel make us feel even more optimistic. You know.
Well, I agree with everything Dan and Josephine have said.
How about they contradicted each other?
Yeah.
You know your joke is a failure when the guy to your right has to explain it. I want to provide a legal perspective, and it's a jurisdictional perspective. It's a recognition that as we look at platforms and just the easy to see technical structure of platforms, is that they're global, and it's very hard through geo-blocking, rate walls, or just any of these technical measures, Josephine can correct me if I'm wrong, to completely keep people out of it. And so countries have to deal with this. And the other perspective, and it's not a legal perspective, it's an economic business perspective, is that there's great value in having interoperability of these systems. And my focus studies on commerce, and commerce will increasingly be on these platforms and driven by these platforms in every way imaginable. And it will be valuable to have less restricted flows of this type of commerce. And I come from the area of international trade, where there are good political reasons to block international commerce. And yet there are also strong economic reasons in terms of volume of trade externalities that make the world better off, that cause states to say, yes, I have some benefits to my individual political system or even to my economic system through terms of trade externalities, but I'm going to make an agreement. And I wonder why we wouldn't see that possibility. It's quite difficult, and things are stagnated. So I see this as globalization on steroids. It used to be we could say commerce can just happen, and we don't have to worry about regulatory types of cooperation. But that really is no longer the case in any area, and especially in this area of costless movement of information and services. And so, it's a question of how different states allocate responsibility. And we are talking about platforms, which by definition are working largely with user-generated content. But of course, when they do moderate or when they use algorithmic methods to enhance the penetration of these things, they're in some ways adding their voice and adding their responsibility. So it is a question of mixed responsibility. One thing I want to say that I think is analytically helpful is that we're always in this context talking about the substantive, what I would call the primary law, the defamation law, the election interference law, the intellectual property law, the hate speech law. And that is there. And all of these efforts that we hear about, Section 230 and the Digital Services Act in the European Union, they say nothing about that primary law. That stays, and that is diverse. And that raises a problem with these platforms. The question we're talking about is actually a narrow, superficial question of the responsibilities of the platforms. And when we do talk about responsibilities of platforms, we're kind of admitting defeat, or the governments are admitting defeat. They're saying, we can't regulate this hate speech any longer because A, it's so jurisdictionally fragmented, and B, it has such velocity and such volume that we can't really handle it. So we're going to push this responsibility onto the platforms and say, you do it. I think that raises really interesting questions, including questions as I look at the Digital Services Act and its mandates of due diligence to prevent things like election interference. I wonder, is that free speech? Is that government suggesting and inducing private actors to regulate speech the way that they want it regulated? So we've been talking about this secondary law, platform responsibility, but I think it's really important to think about the primary law too, and there will be strong forces that will cause us to think about how much we can manage the primary law. And this is one response that I would say to Dan. It's not enough to say we're not going to cooperate on platform regulation. We have to ask the question, are there components of these issues that we now have to cooperate on because of platforms? And so maybe, and this was some of the learning from our infectious disease paper, maybe there are areas of low-hanging fruit where there's less diversity. So if we say, oh, powerful states, big issues in election monitoring, yes, we'll never do anything. But if we say, okay, what about sex trafficking? Or what about something that there's more agreement on? Can we start with that? And actually, maybe we get some experience, we build some trust, we build some institutions and ideas in those low-hanging fruit areas, and perhaps we can move further in that area. So, so we have conflicts of regulation. We have clear conflicts. Some states say you must allow hate speech, and some states say you must take down hate speech. And so we have to find ways to deal with that. One of the things that everybody's wondering about Elon Musk, and I don't want to talk too much about him or his deal because I don't know much about it. But the one thing I do know is he said, by free speech, quote, by free speech, I simply mean that which matches the law. I am against censorship that goes far beyond the law. And everybody who knows about law asks, well, which law, Elon? Because there's German hate speech law and there's United States free speech law, and there are 100, 200 countries in between. So it's really tough to answer these questions in that simple way. And it's true that different countries regulate speech in different ways. We still have, newspapers that get published and people see them. Actually, I think we should change the name of this to Fletcher Tweet or something. Modern approach. So I think there's a fundamental trade-off. And in 1996, when Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act was legislated, the United States said, we want to build this infrastructure. We don't want worries about liability to hold it down. And that may or may not have been a good idea at the time, but it's been 24 years, 26 years. I didn't go to MIT.
Go up on that.
It's been 26 years. We've had an amazing growth of these platforms because the problem is the primary liability, as I said, not necessarily so much the secondary rules. I think we might be able to make progress in different ways. Different countries will want to make those trade-offs in different ways, and Dan's right. There are powerful countries and weak, and the powerful are more influential. But I think it's easier. So here are the responses I think I would suggest we pursue. It's easier to break it up into different pieces and try to work on the easy stuff first. The United States, interestingly, has, before Trump really became aware of it, has tried to propagate Section 230 in international trade agreements like the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, and the US-Japan agreement. That hasn't been terribly effective, but the United States was trying to do that. The one approach, and Dan mentioned this, is the club approach. The club approach could just splinter and say there's a Western group and there's a authoritarian group, and they're going to have different platforms and they'll be separated, and the world will be Eastia and Asia. What's it?
Oceania.
I knew there was a reason I wanted to be here with you guys. So you could have that kind of splinter in this area. In trade regulation, we talk about rules of national treatment. That would say wherever you go, you're subject to the regulation of that place. You could have rules of proportionality that say, we understand everybody's got different primary goals, just don't mess with the platform more than is necessary to achieve those primary goals. That might have some benefits. You could work on harmonization. Well, one thing that I was thinking of as Josephine was speaking is, the idea of the Brussels effect, and the European Union is definitely thinking along these lines, that if we as a big, valuable market set the pace in our General Data Protection Regulation and our proposed Digital Services Act and our Digital Markets Act on competition, if we set the pace, the firms will go along in order to enter our markets, and then their governments will say, well, it's already a fait accompli, so we'll just legislate the same way as the European Union. So that may be part of the story that we see, where the difference is reduced through this insidious private sector mechanism, such that we establish greater conditions for harmonization. It'll vary by area, and it'll take a lot of time, and it's a difficult managerial problem. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joel. So we've kind of been on a roller coaster here, where Dan took us down, and then Josephine lifted us up, and then Joel took us down a little bit and lifted us up again on a hopeful note. So I only feel my responsibility now is to take it on again, just to kind of keep with the rhythm here. So we all know that Twitter is involved in a lawsuit. Anybody who's not aware of that? Can anyone name what the lawsuit is? Okay, the lawsuit that I have in mind is Twitter versus Taamneh. How many of you know about Twitter versus Taamneh? It's going up in front of the Supreme Court right now. There's also Google versus Gonzalez, also going up in front of the Supreme Court. It's going to be the first major challenge to Section 230 at the Supreme Court. Now, we all know what the Supreme Court is all about. We're reading all about the interesting direction that that court is taking. The United States itself is on a path to potentially open up this Section 230 law, which seems to be kind of at the center of the universe that kind of created the internet and its children as it currently stands. But we're seeing a lot of pressures acting on it at the federal level, at the Supreme Court level. We're also seeing a whole bunch of pressures acting on it from the bottom up. So there are challenges to some of the spirit of Section 230 from the states. California has just passed a law, AB 587. Texas passed a law. Florida passed a law, all for different reasons. And we could go into details as to where those laws stand. Those laws, some of them have been challenged, and most of them will end up at the Supreme Court. Now, the reason why I say this is because the United States is obviously a very important market, a very important part of the world that gave the world the platforms, most of the major platforms that we are talking about, bar one or two, but it's also a very important market from a commercial standpoint. So Facebook makes over $50 a user from every user in North America. Facebook makes about $15 a user from every user in the European Union. Facebook makes a little under $10 per user on average in the world. So just think about what Facebook's most important commercial interests are to keep the North American market, in particular the US market, in a good place. Okay, that's point one. Where is Facebook, putting aside the commercial aspect, where is Facebook facing the greatest regulatory pressures? Well, it's facing a whole lot of regulatory pressures from a bunch of different jurisdictions, the European Union being one of them, because the European Union has gone out ahead of all the jurisdictions in actually setting some frameworks in place, and the DSA, the Digital Services Act, being one of the most significant ones. But there are lots of other places that are putting pressure on the major platforms. Countries like India has got something in play. China, of course, is sort of out of bounds for most of the Western platforms. So I'm putting China aside. But Brazil has got some ongoing issues there. So there are pressures that are bubbling up from all over. Now, another little interesting detail. Facebook, the blue platform, has 10% of its users in the United States and 90% of its users outside the United States. Of all of its content moderation resources, guess what percentage it puts on the United States market?
90%.
Close to 90%. So 90% of its resources, actually 87%, this is coming out of the Frances Haugen revelations, the Facebook papers, 87% of all of Facebook's content moderation resources are dedicated to the 10% user base. Okay, so why do I say all this? It's because as the pressures of the United States, already the commercial pressures are very high, but this is the most important market. As the regulatory pressures start bearing down on Facebook, what does Facebook do? It's got a limited budget that it wants to put against content moderation. Already 87% is devoted to the United States. It'll put even more onto the United States at the expense of the rest of the world. Maybe the European jurisdiction will get some of those resources because the Europeans are the squeaky wheel. But the rest of the world, Nigeria, India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Kenya, Cameroon, name your favorite country, will get starved of these resources. And by the way, a lot of the misinformation or any kind of information that comes on those platforms are coming in these strange languages called not English. So I don't know if you've seen the famous video of there's a picture of Kamala Harris getting her vaccine shot, and then there was a message at the bottom of it saying this is fake. It's actually not Kamala Harris, it's somebody else. And that post, when it was in English, it was taken down in a few hours because it violated Facebook's rule of misinformation. But the Spanish language version of that post still out, and maybe it's still out. That's because for some reason Facebook, doesn't think of taking down a Spanish language lie relative to an English lie. So this is the situation we're in, which is basically as countries that are powerful, both politically and economically, and basically the kind of the hegemons, as they clamp down on misinformation, we end up with what I would call a misinformation paradox, which is content moderation resources get pulled away to these superpowers away from the rest of the world, where 90% of the users are, where the risks of misinformation are much greater. Here we're jumping up and down about January 6th. Oh my God, what a terrible thing that happened here in January 6th. In Myanmar, January 6th is happening on February 6th and March 6th and every month of the year. Does Facebook care? Not really. They didn't even have anybody in Yangon. They didn't have anybody who spoke the language. So how could they even take anything down? And actually they took down the people who were trying to fact check some posts in Myanmar. Anyway, I get ahead of my story. So essentially my job here is to paint start with the gloom from Dan Drezner and come back to the a sense of gloom, which is that the more regulation we push down the throats of the platforms, the problem is actually going to get worse, not in the United States or the EU, but in the rest of the world. And that gets me really worried. And the way things are going for these platforms, we don't see resource allocation going in that direction. Well, Facebook, for instance, used to set up war rooms before every major election. Countries like Brazil and India were considered tier 0 or tier 1 for being at highest risk during elections, along with the United States. A Brazilian election is underway right now. Facebook doesn't have the same level of resources put against Brazilian elections, at least from what we can see from the outside. Now, our friends at Facebook may have better data, so hopefully I'll be corrected on this. Because the focus of management has shifted. The focus of management, has shifted because there's a recession and Facebook has got a 10% hiring cut. And also its strategic focus has shifted to the metaverse. So putting up war rooms is not its number one priority. Anyway, I just wanted to kind of talk about a few potential solutions. And one of the solutions which I'm actually quite hopeful of, which Josephine talked about, which is that the pandemic actually oddly created an opportunity for the platforms to have a reasonable discussion, a rational discussion about what is misinformation and what is authentic information. And whenever we talk about something scientific, there is a basis for being able to make that kind of distinction, and perhaps they get better and better at it. And they have got better. Over the course of the pandemic, we've seen the platforms get much better. They made a lot of mistakes along the way that they got better. But in terms of other kinds of misinformation, hate speech, and other sort of harmful content, they are simply not getting better. That's the sad news. Now, perhaps they can get better in some of the ways that Joel was talking about. Essentially some kind of a Brussels effect, which sort of gets the flywheel going, and eventually everybody arrives at some kind of a standard, and then that gets adopted, and then the governments go here around the standard, and perhaps something like that can get going. So maybe there's an opportunity to do that. So that's kind of pathway one. Pathway two is every regulator for themselves. So the Americans go their own way, and of course, by their own way means it's completely fragmented. There's something that's happening in the Supreme Court. People in Congress are trying to put some sort of a bill together, which no one can ever agree. California does its own thing, Texas does its own thing, Florida does its own thing, and so that's the United States. EU's kind of got its own rules in place. India puts its own rules in place, and so it's every regulator for themselves. And what do we end up with? We end up with the problem that Professor Drezner was talking about, essentially a tragedy of the commons, where there is no harmonization and it's just a patchwork quilt. And so the platforms just say, we're just going to throw up our hands. The alternative to it is coordination. Now, in terms of coordination, there is a standard problem of essentially beggar thy neighbor. Because I want to, as a politician, as political entities, regulators have to keep their constituencies happy. So they have to do whatever they can to keep their internal constituents happy. And if there is an incentive to coordinate, there's always, those coordination games are fundamentally unstable for several of the reasons that Dan was talking about. And inherently, we see this kind of instability in trade negotiations, for instance, currency devaluations. Right now, the United States is going through, an equivalent of a beggar thy neighbor in terms of how the Fed is adjusting its interest rates, and that has an impact on the rest of the world. But the Fed in the United States has to look after its own citizens. It can't really look out for the rest of the world, and there could be sort of an analogous problem that could arise in the case of coordinating over misinformation. Another problem with coordinating over misinformation is that the countries are too different. Some of them are very large countries, but not with much economic power. Others require an enormous amount of caring and feeding. We think about a country like India, so many different languages, even though most of the content moderators are Indian, ironically, but most of them are put to use to serve the American and the EU market. But there are far too many languages in which the bad stuff can spread in countries like India. So it just inherently creates instability. Another approach is to give regulators extra jurisdictional power. So whatever rules the regulator puts in place, it actually extends beyond their jurisdiction. And the current law that is in California, AB 587, and I'm going to get into a lot of dangerous territory because I have a lawyer and I know nothing about the law. But my understanding is that is a very difficult thing to enforce for a regulator, to set rules that go beyond their jurisdictional control. And it could also create complications because the way California defines certain things like free speech and other things are different from the way other jurisdictions, either other states or foreign countries define it. And once you have those contradictions, these laws are not enforceable. Finally, I think yet another issue here is that so much of our focus is on platforms like Facebook and Twitter and so on. We have other platforms as well. As we know, the fastest growing platform, the one with the greatest engagement and potentially with the highest risk of harm is TikTok. And TikTok has a different dynamic playing. For it, the United States is not only the biggest commercial market, it's also the biggest political market because TikTok's other complication is that it's owned by a Chinese company. And everybody's worried, rightly so, that is there a backdoor to the Chinese state through ByteDance into TikTok, into American user data and potentially manipulating American public. So TikTok is going to double down on serving the American market and completely ignore markets in Brazil, Kenya, Nigeria. In fact, during the Kenyan election, TikTok, according to Mozilla Foundation report, was the single greatest threat to democracy in Kenya. And that is likely to be perpetuated. So I ultimately throw my hands up and say, there are lots of options. None of them seem perfect. Let's at least do one thing, which is we've been talking about platform responsibility. Let's put a certain amount of investment against user responsibility because it takes two to clap. Platforms disseminate hate speech, but there needs to be a user at the other end to absorb that hate speech and feel hateful. So we need to invest in digital hygiene, digital education, and doing that from elementary school onwards and make that a standard, just like reading and writing and science and the theory of evolution. But then I start getting despondent again, because even school curricula now are up for debate and politicization. So on that gloomy note, I bring this back to my colleagues here to see if there are other ideas and thoughts and challenges that you have thought of and you listen to each one of us ramble.
Well, I'm appalled, Bhaskar, that you're suggesting injecting even more critical race theory in schools. I can't. So I want to thank my colleagues because they've told me at some points. Surprisingly, I'm unpersuaded by them in the sense that I guess I have two sort of three macro responses to what was said. The first is, and I do take Professor Wolff's points well, which does suggest that there might be a situation where, at least within, let's say, the transatlantic community, there could be common standards through the sort of private digital platforms as opposed to what states are doing. What I am skeptical about is whether that actually translates to global standards, because again, there's China, there's Russia, there's a whole bunch of other countries that are not necessarily going to be interested in this. And furthermore, I've obviously excluded a lot of these platforms and are likely to exclude them in the future. So I'm not sure that counts as global, although I do think it suggests, in jurisdictions that perhaps are of some concern, there might be more consensus than we would otherwise say. On Joel's suggestion that surely we can have like areas of low-hanging fruit and from that perhaps build further cooperation. Within international relations theory, there's a term for that. It's called neo-functionalism. It's the idea that, when you're starting, with actors that don't get along all that well, maybe what you can do is, again, start with the common, lowest common denominator, just do simple things like cultural agreements and other sort of, surely everyone can agree that we could agree to this, with the hope that somehow by doing that, it spills over into more serious areas of disagreement. Ernie Haas, who was the international relations professor who put forward neo-functionalism, 20 years later, caught to the fact that he was wrong. But that's not how it works. That is very rare that you can generate agreement and sort of de minimis and then have that sort of bloom even further if the preferences remain divergent. And so I'm skeptical of whether that's gonna happen. And in some ways that leads to the last point, which is something that Bhaskar closed with, which is there is a danger in our conversation here to believe that the fault lies with the platforms, and only with the platforms. And I'm not saying that that's not true. I'm not going to defend Facebook on this front, but I am going to suggest that in many areas where there's been loud cries that disinformation played a role in an election or, led to a favorable political outcome, it's not that this is the first time these sorts of attempts have been tried. And what's interesting was this was the first time these attempts perhaps worked. And the reason they might have worked wasn't so much disinformation themselves, but rather they were pushing on an open door, that there were people in a lot of these countries primed to want to believe in the disinformation. And if that's the problem, then regulating this on one platform isn't going to stop it. It's just going to surface on a different platform or surface even, God forbid, not on the internet, but through some other way. So I guess I'm skeptical that as political polarization becomes a problem, that dealing with the secondary laws will address the primary.
Okay, couple quick thoughts. I think you're right to say we haven't engaged with China and Russia. On the other hand, if they're not going to use the same platforms as the rest of the world, then arguably you don't need to have common standards. And moreover, arguably you don't need to have common standards at all, because what all the platforms do now is they have a German version of Facebook and a US version of Facebook and a French version and an Ethiopian version, and you sort of follow everybody's laws on those versions.
Sorry, I want to add on this point,
Yeah.
and again, that's not the worst outcome. That's a perfectly fine outcome. You don't necessarily, trying to have common standards isn't always the way to go. And that's important.
Right, and you get that outcome because all these countries are never going to agree on laws. You brought up the Brussels effect, right? This idea that Europe has figured out they can sort of worm their way into the rest of the world, or worm their laws into the rest of the world, right? That's been going on for a very long time, back in 2000, when Yahoo was fighting with the French government over whether or not it's going to take down Nazi paraphernalia, which is illegal in France, not just from the French version of their auction site, but also from all of the other versions, which can still be accessed from France. They basically throw up their hands at a certain point and they say, okay, we're just going to take it off the whole site, right? We're just going to make it Yahoo policy that we don't allow Nazi paraphernalia, because otherwise the path this goes down is we have to enforce all French laws on all versions of our site. And then every country is going to want that kind of treatment. And where does that end? So absolutely, that's a very real concern. I think the low-hanging fruit piece is an interesting one. The clearest example of that we have on the internet is probably child sexual abuse materials, right? Which is pretty universally agreed as content we don't want on the internet. Pretty universally illegal in most countries. And I think you see some kinds of progress there, right? You see some ability, especially because it's material you can detect with automation much more effectively than something like hate speech. So you do see a lot more detection, a lot more reports of that. I think the flip side of that, and it gets to something that all three of you have said, and it's really interesting because when you, it's not a sentiment you hear a lot sort of in the internet policy world anymore. And it's this idea of sort of why are we going after the intermediaries, right? Why aren't we going after the people who are posting hate speech or the people who are reading the hate speech? And I think when you look at the child sexual abuse material world, right, what you see is, okay, the problem is not the platforms. They're policing for this pretty aggressively. They're reporting it to the National Center for Exploited and Missing Children pretty aggressively. And then everything falls apart because they're reporting 2 million incidents a year. And of those, 2 or 3 are actually being investigated and pursued because many of the perpetrators are overseas, or many of them can't be traced effectively, or there's limited resources in the law enforcement side. And so I think,
by the way, the worst platform for child abuse is not the usual suspects. It's Twitch. Twitch is the best place if you're
live streaming is certainly a particular challenge, right? Again, because of the automation, right? So if you're scanning for child sexual abuse materials, usually you're using a database that's maintained of here are the known child sexual abuse videos and images that you should scan for. If somebody's live streaming something, you don't have a match to look for in the same way. You actually need a law enforcement official to be in that stream and sort of identify people as it's going. So I think the larger point I would make about who's responsible and who's held responsible by policymakers is that you're absolutely right. This is policymakers giving up. But it's them giving up because they've been really bad at policing various kinds of cybercrime and online speech in the past. you're all probably too young to remember, but when I was in college, there was a whole industry in sending letters to individual college students, like, we see you've downloaded this movie illegally, right? We can come find you. That is sort of the individual responsibility model, in which you go after individual people and say, you're doing something bad online, we're gonna come find you. There are some very high profile stories.
How many of those letters did you get?
Amazing, it's covering my digital footprint. The point being, right, that it's not that nobody wants to hold the people who are posting that stuff responsible. It's not that nobody wants to train children to be better at, assessing and sorting out disinformation. It's that the criminal side of that doesn't, come to meetings and listen to the government. And the children, nobody has figured out what it is that you can do to sort of effectively staunch disinformation at the recipient end. And so that kind of leaves us with the platforms as the place where the policymakers think, okay, at least they're going to come to meetings. At least we sort of know how to punish them. And it's certainly not a perfect system, but I don't think it's about sort of feeling like they're the villains, though certainly after 2016, that sentiment takes hold in a real way. I think it's really sort of a sign of frustration and a sign of we don't know what else to regulate in this.
It's an interesting point. And, as I listen to you, Josephine, I'm starting to think that this is a problem of, maybe it's incredibly obvious, a problem of modernity and a kind of communications and commerce that we're just not really well equipped to handle. And as I look at the premier example of some smart people trying to think about this and what to do, the Digital Services Act kind of budgets it. It says, well, we're not going to tell everyone what to say, and we're going to leave national law in place in those primary areas that I mentioned. And new platforms, you don't absolutely have to monitor for hate speech or election interference or other stuff, but we're going to check you every year and see if you perform due diligence. And so it's a kind of soft way, but there's an iron fist inside that velvet glove that says you've got to do something. And I think it's this admission that we can't do it because of free speech, human rights, but something needs to be done. And so it's a deep social change. Maybe there's a way to resist it and reduce it, but otherwise we've got to manage it.
Could I just ask you a question on that? I'm sorry, Joel,
Yeah.
Which is one of the critiques leveled against the California law, which to some extent is not an exact replica of the DSA, but a version of it.
Yes.
And the critique was made by Eric Goldman, one of our contributors, is that the California law requires each platform to submit 161 plus documents, at every cycle when it does this. So it's adding this massive amount of bureaucracy without, at a lot of cost, without a huge amount of social benefit.
Well, the United States is a federation, and we have a central government that's empowered under the Commerce Clause to preempt state regulation. Maybe California's game is to push the federal government to act. We have the same Commerce Clause prohibits regulation that restricts commerce, and questions that the Supreme Court will undoubtedly hear is whether the Texas law or the California law is a burden on interstate commerce. But it's really exactly the same question that we're asking about international commerce. And, I was very interested when I read in the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act of the European Union, the European Commission is required to make what they call subsidiarity statements, which are statements about why it makes sense to regulate this at the union level. And those statements were, it's too diverse and we can't have the kind of commerce we want if we don't regulate it at the European Union. And, if you just change European Union to global, those statements make exactly the same sense. So in the US federal system, we can't live with diverse regulation of this type. And I think what it forces, and maybe this is what you're pointing out, Bhaskar, is that California and Texas can't have the kind of diversity that they used to have. This is the problem that we have to grapple with. And with, I say this with trepidation, it's a functionalist problem. The world has changed. We have these demands because of changing technology and commerce, and government has to respond. And I think the Monet and Schumann functionalists said, it's going to be a cascading effect as commerce happens. And this has been borne out, obviously, in the European Union and in the United States Federation. As commerce increased, and it's happening today at the World Trade Organization, as commerce increases, we recognize that we need more regulatory cooperation because of that economic integration. And we're recognizing that we can't just have business, we need to have the right coordinating regulation to manage that business at the national level, and at the European Union level, and at the WTO. And I think it's important also that security is part of this, as you suggest. And so we need to understand that these platforms are part of a broad cybersecurity set of issues, and it's not going to be resolved. In the trade world, everybody's saying we can't have data localization. We have to have movement of data. And if you're going to have movement of data, you've got to work on these things. So there are a lot of pressures, a lot of inconsistent pressures. I think in order to answer these questions as a functionalist, one has to drill down and say, what are the incentives? What is the game that we're playing in specific areas? And platforms, platform regulation and analysis has a role, but it's not the only game to address. And we have to see what needs to be done because of these changes that have happened, that were behind, and what needs to be done to manage those changes.
So I want to throw this back to the room, very conscious of the fact that on this side of the room, and Josephine has already dated herself by, all the letters she got in college. But this side of the room is
Friends of mine.
This side of the room are primarily digital refugees, and that side of the room are the digital natives. So you are closer to what we are talking about here on the outside. But if I were to just also drop two magic wand options, which are in my long list of potential pathways. So there's one magic wand option, which of course we shall all simple with, which is algorithms. Someday in the future, there will be this Uber algorithm that will catch everything. That's one. The second magic wand option is the Wikipedia solution, which is eventually the market will take care of. And the fact checkers will swoop in every time there's the incorrect stuff out there. The peaceful people will swoop in every time there's hate speech, and it will self-correct, and somehow things will take care of them. Of course, we know that those are magic wand solutions, and it's just useful models, which are far from reality. But we'd love to hear from you. Where do you think the solutions might lie? Where might they begin? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Are you somewhere in between? What would you recommend to Elon Musk now that he is about to take on this new role?
You should go to Mars and just stay there. That's the only recommendation.
Do you have a proposal, Anu?
I don't believe in repealing Section 230. I'm kind of an ardent, as I'm sure Professor Wolff knows from me having taken the classes. But I do think that one of the solutions would be to rewrite and reframe the way that it's a 26-year-old law, and technology is not what it was then. So I think one of the ways that in my opinion, the best way I would suggest is to rewrite it so that it can include not just the new technologies that we have, but also, the pace at which technology is evolving. Like, we don't know what's coming I'm not saying, it's not that we don't know what's coming next, but yeah, somewhat. We can't predict everything.
Can you provide us an outline of the rewriting, not necessarily rewrite everything, but is it, I mean, there's some liability now we're going to impose on the platform, the liability to do what?
I mean, you're holding a laptop, surely it's in there.
I'm live tweeting.
Oh, okay.
No, I think that it goes a little, I agree with what Professor Trachtman said about the DSA, and I think that there should be some provisions of due diligence that can be included in section 230, like basically the intermediary liability thing, or platform responsibility. The whole idea is based on, putting up some community guidelines and sort of encouraging the marketplace of free ideas, but also ensuring that, these guidelines are followed.
So they be transparent about their processes that they use
Yes.
to catch the bad stuff.
So just on that, when section 230 was legislated, one of the ideas was it's like the telephone. We don't regulate, the telephone company in relation to what people say on the telephone. But I think one of the things that is, clearly distinct today is the algorithms. And it makes the idea is you're not liable as a publisher if you're the platform, but the platform through the algorithms is making publication decisions. And so maybe that's a way to think about where the liability should be.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if we go down the path of platform liability, we're just never going to stop. And it's going to become a thing of, like, not even just in between countries. I think between regime changes, we're going to have, regulating platforms for different things. It's a slippery slope, and I genuinely don't think that it's sort of a one. I do believe that there should be some responsibility on the platforms, a lot of responsibility on the platforms, but I think just saying that, we're going to use platform liability as, we're going to get rid of section 230 altogether and say now platforms are responsible for the content that's posted online is going to be a slippery slope in terms of, free speech. And I know it's a tried and true argument that everyone gives, but I think that we're becoming more, like there are leaders around the world that are emerging that are not the best. And I'm trying to be diplomatic about it. But I think that if we completely, if we introduce some form of platform liability, that they can take advantage of it. And that's probably not going to be good for people who are using these platforms to actually, like protest or.
So let's get a few more ideas in the mix. Other Arpita, you have, go ahead.
I think I think the idea of safe harbor when it was introduced was a different internet altogether. We were looking at platforms that could not do what platforms are doing now. Like platforms are no longer passive actors. And as Professor Trachtman said, that the algorithmic power they have to make these decisions to kind of put cats on the top of my tweets is probably so powerful that it could kind of push states to clamp down on these platforms. I think there's a need to kind of have a new vision of what safe harbor looks like, given the lack of algorithmic transparency. Implement transparency mandates where you're not only sharing information about algorithms, but also your content moderation decisions and what's going behind those content moderation decisions, how who's making it, and like what kind of principles you're using for it. Is it just free speech, First Amendment rules, or are you including your own rules? Or is there a possibility to kind of come up with a consensus for community guidelines, which is decentralized, right? And like that's what Web3 could potentially look like, where users are going to make rules which all of the users will kind of comply with. So I think there are solutions which could be from policymakers, from users, and platforms.
one we go in disorder here. Yeah, it's gonna.
I don't really have a solution, sorry, but about transparency mandates, I was just wondering if that's such a really good idea, given that when you put this information out there, there's something to be said for these things being obscure and cryptic, because then certain people can't circumvent this. When you have algorithms and everything that you have coded outside and transparent, it becomes even more easier for people to be circumventing these, because now they know exactly what you're looking for. So I'm not really sure if the idea of transparency of mandates and algorithms is as great and glorious as it really sounds.
Yeah, because you can figure out how to misspell words, come up with new code words and dog whistles to get around it. I'm curious, Josephine, do you think that's a concern to be worried about?
So I think the sort of policy proposals we've seen around transparency stop short of you have to detail out what your algorithms are. Right? If you look at the DSA mandate, they say you have to have a sort of clear explanation of what your policies are around content moderation. Same thing if you're looking at, say, the Texas state law or the now sort of struck down Florida state law. So California also stops short of saying, you know, tell us the keywords you're searching for, probably because the algorithms aren't sufficiently straightforward for it to be that simple. As you know, we look for this word and we block that post at this point. So I think you're right that there's, you know, certainly in some of the criminal policing, the algorithms are, say, that database I was talking about of child sexual abuse materials, that's closely held for multiple reasons. One is that all the material in it is illegal, but another is that you don't actually want people to be able to sort of match that material and say, oh, if I manipulate these pixels, then I can get it through. I think most of the policy proposals we've seen are less about kind of you have to publish your algorithm and more about you have to explain it so that people have some understanding when their content gets taken down, right? And some of them are even really kind of due process. You have to give people a way to appeal if something is taken down that they've posted. So I think that sort of in terms of specificity, I don't see that being a huge problem with the proposals on the table, but you're right that it's something that you would want to think about in all of these cases.
That's the takedown algorithm. What about the amplification?
Yeah, so here we're getting into a sort of separate world of algorithmic regulation, which is the EU has also been fairly aggressive about. And there again, you're seeing a lot of variability on kind of what explaining an algorithm looks like. And I think that's still pretty up in the air, what that's going to end up meaning, right? If I say, you know, you need to explain to me the newsfeed algorithm, if you're going to use it to determine what you show people, then there's a question of sort of how well anybody at Facebook understands that algorithm and the decision it makes, and what it would mean to explain it to a bunch of people who aren't sort of trained in machine learning in a useful way. I think one of the concerns from EU regulators has been, oh, these companies are going to put out something super technical that nobody understands at all. And then they're going to say, you asked us to explain the algorithm and you did. What more do you want from us? So I think sort of striking that balance is going to be challenging.
I found interesting in your paper, Bhaskar, the statement that false statements are amplified much more, resound much more than true statements. And you know, it seems to me that the amplification in at least some of these areas is the problem itself, and maybe that's something that could be regulated.
There are liability proposals around that too. Can you be liable for retweeting something that's false? Can you be liable for liking it?
Is there a question from the Zoom? So we have time for two. We'll take one from in the room and one from Zoom, and then we'll take a break if that's okay with everybody.
So this is a question from Hunter Sanchez, who is a content moderator at Meta and a lecturite, who says, curious to hear your thoughts on the oversight board, which is an independent body that was created by Meta that people can appeal if they disagree. So he's putting his Fletcher hat on and he thinks it's a fascinating case study in terms of soft law governance. Are there ways in which you might think the concept could be expanded?
Oversight board.
So I think what I'd say about the oversight board, kind of back to what I mentioned at the very beginning about Facebook not wanting to bear responsibility for these decisions, is that it's super useful for them, or they're hoping it will be super useful for them to say, look, blocking Trump was not really our decision, right? We appealed to our Supreme Court. These experts, all world-renowned people in, their fields, came back and they told us, yes, you should do this, or no, you shouldn't.
They ruled, no, they ruled frown emoji, that's what I.
Right, so I mean, it's not to say I think the oversight board is a bad thing. I just think that it's in line with the tech companies not wanting to be in this business of deciding who's allowed on their platforms or what kind of speech is on their platforms. I think it could be expanded. I think it will depend a lot on sort of how much of a success this is viewed as and whether or not other companies look at it and say we want to.
Someone from Massachusetts instead of Texas, I'm less worried about what gets taken down than what gets amplified. I'd like to see an oversight board looking at the algorithms.
So right now, I should say the oversight board, you can't appeal to them about things that aren't taken down. You can only appeal to the Facebook oversight board for takedowns. But one of the things that's been proposed is expanding it along those lines.
Yeah. And also, I think one concern about the oversight board is that it is just one finite body. And the sheer amount of decision-making that would be on any docket, you would end up with a lot of focus once again on the US and EU issues, even though the oversight board has a pretty good global coverage. But still, I just think it's too hegemonic in terms of the decisions that get prioritized. It takes a long time to figure out whether Trump should be let in or let out of this space. Anyway, let's take one more question. Should we toss a coin or do one of you?
No, actually, my question was about the oversight
Okay, so
board.
there was a question back there. Yeah, last question.
So
Or last comment, actually. We're looking for ideas, no more questions.
Okay, but I did want to pose this as a question because I don't think this is a good.
Good for you.
All platform liability, we don't want to hear from you.
But it was going back to the point about amplification. And so, I mean, we've been focusing on what can we do about content? How can we deal with so-and-so content? How, but one big thing that comes up is also like, what is it that you can filter out as core responsibility of the platform? So focusing on core platform behavior as opposed to user behavior. So user behavior is uploading certain content, taking certain content. But there's also a core responsibility of the platform here, as also what Anu said and what Arpita said. We moved beyond that idea of like a passive platform, and we need a platform that and now these platforms are actively pushing certain content. So I mean, there was a lot of like talk about how Facebook ran this experiment about amplifying certain negative information to see if that creates greater ad revenue for them because it's based on greater engagement with content on their platform because it's negative. So, and I mean, that's something that is actively also being done. You can see that like a lot of content does tend to be, which gets amplified or pushed on your feed, tends to be content that is negative or likely to be more controversial or scandalous in nature. And that's likely to also then be, content that's not, like well thought out or something like that. Could be disinformation. So can we clearly bifurcate responsibility where if a platform is pushing certain information, they know that certain users are prone to amplifying or putting up, bad content. Could you police something like that? And, so you start focusing on like these pockets of disinformation as opposed to focusing on like disinformation as that abstract meta notion.
I mean, I do think you're going to see a lot of that depending on how the Supreme Court term goes. Both of those Supreme Court cases related to Section 230 that Bhaskar brought up are about extremist Islamist content, right? They're about kind of, did Facebook and in the other case, Twitter and Google as well, not do enough to counter ISIS content? Were they actively showing it to people who they thought had an interest in it? Not because the companies made conscious decisions to do so, but because that's how their algorithms work. And I do think that probably, depending on how those cases go, and we have some hints from things that these Supreme Court justices have said in previous rulings, that's going to refocus a lot of attention on that particular silo of content and sort of get a lot more interest from all of the major platforms around that. And you've seen some of that before. You've seen it around sex trafficking with Sesta and Fosta. There's been a lot of sort of focus on that particular kind of content. And you've seen the expansion of liability around that content, for better or for worse. So I think you're right to sort of highlight that as a trajectory for this space. I think the issue for the platforms, one of many, is trying to sort of figure out and stay on top of which types of content they're going to have to emphasize and what's going to get regulators angry and what's going to get users angry. And they've certainly seen that shift just in the past few years.
So I think this is about time for us to transition from food for thought to food. And Dorothy, as a transition, could we just play the video? Because that might be the right bridge. It's got a little bit of us. Then we'll hit pause and continue the conversation outside.
What else is new?
I know.
Want, but just make sure you write it in this font. That's crucial. Now mention any religious text and talk about body, mind, spirit, or something like that, and make sure that you.
And just the background on this is how to create misinformation. Just a quick handy guide in less than 1 minute. Just want to go to the.
Here's how you make brown parents believe literally anything. You're going to start with the plain background and write whatever you want, but just make sure you write it in this font. That's crucial. Now mention any religious text and talk about body, mind, spirit, or something like that. And make sure that you mention a Harvard scientist helped confirm ancient wisdom. We love those headlines. Don't actually mention anything but the research or the wisdom. Just make sure you say it was done by Harvard. Now make a diagram that looks scientific and religious at the same time and throw some Sanskrit on there. Don't worry about accuracy. Beautiful. Now mention some chemicals. I chose Kanye and Drake's name and made them look like. It doesn't matter if they're real or not. Our uncles and aunties have PhDs in science, but that's no match for WhatsApp. Pull in some pictures of pines and nuts or leaves or whatever, and just say how they're generically good for you. Be as creative as you want. Don't let reality hold you back now. But do make sure that you draw arrows and circles so they know what to look at. Now, it's imperative that you insult Western medicine and culture at this last part. You know the drill, 3 dots, 3 exclamation points, cite your sources, and make the image quality a little worse. And that is perfection.
Thank you for that. Hopefully you can learn from that last bit, but even more learnings from the previous hour's discussion. But we hope to learn from you because I think the solution comes from you guys. I think we can only raise the question. So thank you, Joel, Josephine, Dan. For the
That is definitely not.
Yeah, I was like, I needed to keep up. Yeah, but I gave up after. Take it a second. That's all.